This is the Great War Discussion Group. Our presenter this month is Mike Burke, who will give a second part of the mysteries of the timeline. And Mike has gone through the timeline, east and west, and picked out things that he found interesting that I think we will find interesting as well. We have next then Mike Burke, who will talk about mysteries of the timeline, deuxième partie.
All right. Well, hey, thank you very much, Charlie, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to this second effort on talking about our timeline. Again, my overall effort, I think, is to kind of renew interest or taking a look at some of the events that are listed on our timeline. As I mentioned the last time we chit-chatted, that there's a lot of depth and breadth to the short description that you may see on a particular timeline. And so we'll start here with we'll start beginning at here in the Western Gallery. And essentially what I've done is I've identified 13 discrete events, 14 if you count the one on November and 10 November. And then by special request, I've got an item at the end that I'll bring up. As usual, we'll talk our way through that, end up with the conclusion and our references, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers at that time. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and take that first event, 16 April 1917. So the specific event, as it's written on the timeline, talks about Lenin arriving in Petrograd after having been smuggled from Switzerland. Before I really get into any great detail about this particular event, I want to talk a little bit about Lenin himself. So we know that, as we know, he was born in 1870. He was drawn to early Marxist revolutionary causes with the death of his brother in 1887. He was captured and executed for attempting to assassinate Tsar Alexander II. He eventually studied law, began to practice law again in Petrograd, where he ended up moving within the revolutionary Marxist circles. He was arrested in 1895 for his participation in these Marxist organizations. He spent 1 year in jail there in Petrograd, and then he was sent to Siberia for 3 years. When he was released in 1902, he then traveled through Western Europe, where he met with other Russian Marxists. And with them, he ended up establishing the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Another revolution in 1905, essentially, where a lot of strikes take place in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II essentially gives in to the demands of the people who are striking and agrees to establish a Russian constitution and then to establish an elected legislature. However, as in most times occurs in Russia, once law and order had been reestablished, he decided not to go ahead with all of his promises, at which point then Lenin had to leave the country and he flees to Switzerland, where he actually is at the beginning of the First World War. As we know in our studies and our recollection that Russia had the largest army at the beginning of the war. It was large in numbers, but was poorly led, poorly trained, poorly equipped. And by the spring of February, or by February of 1917, the Russian army really has suffered a series of devastating losses on their Western front. The economy is in tatters and ruins. They cannot feed the army. They cannot feed the people. And things come to a head in February of 1917 with the initial revolution. Pressure continues against the Tsar, and on the 1st of March, he actually abdicates and and they establish a temporary government under Kerensky and the Soviets. At which point the Germans, in a stroke of brilliance, if you think about it, for the cost of a railroad car, essentially, they reach out to Lenin and they say, look, we'll take you and 20 of your closest personal friends. We will transport you secretly from Switzerland through Sweden, and then from Sweden on into St. Petersburg. And so that is how Lenin eventually makes his way into St. Petersburg. And the Germans anticipated, or they hoped, that Lenin, once he got back home, would begin to start talking to the people, and that's exactly what he did. And so essentially by the end of October of 1917, as we all know, that the Russians are kind of out of the war. Lenin was a very popular leader. He was a very elegant speaker, and essentially he knew exactly what the people wanted to hear. And his slogan was peace, bread, and land. And that is what they got. Again, November 7th, 1917, you have the Russian Revolution. Kerensky's government is overthrown. Eventually, the Tsar and his family are assassinated. And the rest, as we know, is history. So a little bit more about Lenin. He serves as the first and founding head of government of Soviet Russia from 1917 through 1914. And then he becomes the first head of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1924. He serves as a virtual dictator and the world's first Marxist state, and essentially sets the stage for what we see in World War II and the Cold War afterwards. This picture here, this is after his third stroke, which left him speechless and unable of moving or doing anything. That's his sister on one side and his doctor on the right. And then on the 21st of January of 1924, he passes. And to honor his contribution to the Soviet state, they embalmed his body and they placed it in a mausoleum that we know there at the Kremlin Square. Petrograd also was renamed as Leningrad for that. We do have a kind of a related artifact in the West Gallery, so I'll show that next. And so this is the guidon for the 6th Regiment of the Volinsky Uhlans. You remember Uhlans were light cavalry. They initially armed with lances, eventually armed with rifles, and then were integrated into regular infantry units once the cavalry was not very practical on the Western Front. This particular regiment was assigned to the Warsaw Military District, saw combat in 1914 in Prussia, and later in the Battle of Lodz in December of 1914. In 1915, it's involved in the May to July Gorny-Truro offensive. And then somewhere between 1915 and the spring of 1917, it's reassigned. It makes its way to St. Petersburg. And so this unit actually took part in the February 1917 revolution. And then once the Tsar was abdicated, the soldiers raised up, executed their soldiers, and eventually become part of the Red Army in October of 1917. And so, again, the ending of Lenin, but continuation of this particular story. Next up is Marshal Joffre. Always kind of find it interesting that he found time to make his way to Kansas City. And so a little bit of research on this. As we all know, that General Marshal Joffre was one of the most influential French leaders during the initial and middle part, actually all of the First World War. He was essentially highly praised for his success in organization, development of tactics, the fact that the Allies, the French, were able to hold the Germans on the Marne in the fall of 1914. He actually then becomes the symbol of French resistance and all that is good and well with the French military. He plays, like I said, he plays a significant role essentially in setting the stage for how the French will fight the rest of the war. However, he comes under a lot of criticism after the end of the Battle of Verdun. If you remember, Battle of Verdun begins in, I believe, February of 16, ends in December. The sole objective of the German army was to kill as many Frenchmen as they possibly could, and they did quite a lot of success, essentially in and around Verdun until the fall, where the French were able to push them out. As a result of a lot of criticism, as a result of the casualties suffered in the Battle of Verdun, he comes under a lot of pressure, both from political as well as military leaders. And in December of 1916, essentially, he is replaced, and he's kind of tutelar head, or kind of becomes the public face of the French military and the French government. When the U.S. entered the war in the spring of 17, a lot of people in France, a lot of people in England believed that it was impossible for the American military, or America essentially, to recruit, train, equip, and transport a modern army in time to defeat the Germans on the Western Front. And so the the French and military and British leaders essentially wanted what was called amalgamation. They wanted to take individual American service members and place them into as replacements with inside both British and French units. This was the prevailing thought in England and France, and this is kind of what this delegation. So in the April of 17, a French delegation headed by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, a distant relative of Marquis Lafayette, and General Joffre are assigned or essentially sent from Paris to the United States. The decision to send these folks is made so quickly that they never have an opportunity to sit down and talk about what their mission is. They actually don't even talk about what they're supposed to do in the United States until they get aboard the auxiliary cruiser Lorraine II and are sailing from France to the United States. And essentially, it kind of coalesced kind of what I was talking about. They decided that the best thing to do was to try to convince the Americans to raise an army, train an army, equip an army, and then send it so that it will fight under French and British command. Joffre doesn't really believe this. I'm not sure. I haven't really read anything, and I'm sure there's something out there that talked about it. But he kind of really disagreed with that idea. He really thought that soldiers would fight better with their own leaders in their own organizations, with their own units under their own flags. And so he essentially disagreed with the idea of the mission of this particular mission, and that's kind of what he talks about as he comes through. And so they arrive in the United States. They travel all throughout the United States. They are met with crowds, all fully supportive. They even talk about how when this delegation travels to Chicago, which had a very large pro-German population, that even still they were mostly pro-German, they still welcomed Joffre and the other members of the delegation with open arms. This is an article from the local Kansas City newspapers on the day that he visited. So essentially what happened was the delegation left Chicago and was traveling to St. Louis, and they stopped here on 6 May. They got out just long enough for Joffre to review a Boy Scout troop. And again, as he said, he spoke about how our involvement in the war was going to go ahead and help the war effort. And again, he advocates against amalgamation, and that idea, the fact that we were not going to be amalgamated, gets put into Pershing's orders that he gets from President Wilson. So General Joffre, or Marshal Joffre, was actually very influential in ensuring that Americans fought under American command and for the war. All right, next up, religious event, essentially. So on May 5th, on the 15th of May on May 15th, 1917, Lucia Santos and her two cousins, Ganita and Francesco Martino, essentially were heading out into the fields to take care of their animals. And Lucia describes seeing a woman described as brighter than the sun, shedding rays of light clearer and stronger than a crystal ball filled with the most sparkling water, and pierced by the burning rays of the sun. Amazed, Lucia and her two cousins returned to their village and told everybody essentially of what they had seen, and that was essentially the first visit of Our Lady of Fatima. Now, as a lapsed Catholic, I will throw myself at the mercy of the court by saying that I had actually forgotten many things about this, and I apologize to my mother as she's looking down on me. But I didn't realize, I'd forgotten that these three had actually been visited by three angels. Had been visited by one angel 3 times prior to the actual visit of Our Lady of Fatima. And they occurred in the spring, summer, and the autumn of 1916. And essentially what the angels told them was to prepare themselves for a visit, to begin to pray the rosary, and to stand by essentially until the Lady of Fatima appeared to them. So again, they appeared to her. She appears to them on the 13th of May, and essentially what she says is that she will return to visit with them on the 13th of each month for the next 6 months, and so and that is what she ends up doing. And so, and then that first one, she essentially says, "Hey, come back on the 13th," and then she strongly urges them to say the rosary every day in order to bring peace to the world. And so this is eventually, as it's mentioned, as it's seen here, is mentioned in the newspaper, right? On the 13th of June, her second apparition, she essentially says that she wants them to end each decade of the rosary by saying the Fatima prayer, and essentially also says that all three of them will be taken to heaven upon their death. When they show up when she arrives on the 13th of July, they're shown a vision of hell, essentially, and explain that it's going to take great devotion to Mary, to the Virgin of Fatima, and for them to go ahead and assure that sinners will not make their way into hell. She also predicts the Second World War, the persecution of Christians in Russia during the Russian Revolution, as well as the attempted assassination of a pope, which everyone assumes is Pope John Paul when that occurred. She comes back on this August the 19th. Now, that is not the 13th, but the 19th. Well, one of the local administrators was concerned about what was happening, all the notoriety that was occurring around these three children, and so he put them in jail essentially, so they could not make it to see the Virgin Mary on the 13th of August. And so when they're eventually released, she appears to them on the 19th. So she had to wait a couple of days before they saw her again. And essentially, she again reiterates the fact that that people need to pray, they need to say the rosary, they need to pray for sinners. She appears on the 13th of September, at which point a crowd actually also will accompany the children, and they witness a white rose petals falling from the sky and then disappearing as Lucia asks Our Lady of Fatima to cure the sick. Her final visitation occurs on the 13th of October. Between 70 and 100,000 people will actually witness this, what's called the miracle of the sun, from as far away as 10 miles. And Mary reveals herself as the Lady of the Rosary and says people must amend their lives, ask for forgiveness for their sins, and not offend our Lord anymore. And so essentially, beginning on the May through October, she appears 6 times to these children. So what happened to these kids? Well, eventually, what happens is that the two cousins, Francesco and I know I'm mispronouncing her name, but they both die of the Spanish flu. One in April of 1919, and the young girl in February of 1920. They often told their mother that they would die and they would be taken to heaven, and so they were sure that they would live afterwards, and so they were very matter of fact about it, I guess would be the right way to say it. Eventually, Lucia, in 1922, she joins a religious order. It's the Sister St. Dorothy in Portugal. In 28, she becomes apostolate at a Sisters of St. Dorothy in convent in Spain. She reported 5 more visitations by Mary and the Christ Child in 25, 29, 31, 36, and 41. In 47, she left the Dorothean order, joined the Carmelite order, and eventually she retires to a monastery in Portugal, where she passes in 13 February 2005 at the age of 97. The widely reported miracle of the sun quickly made Fatima a major pilgrimage center. 2 million pilgrims visited the site in the decade following the events of 1917. A small chapel, the Capinella, you see that in this photograph down there at the bottom, was built on the exact site of the Marian apparitions. In 1920, pilgrims defied government troops and enshrined a statue of the Virgin Mary in the chapel. In 1930, the Catholic Church officially recognized the apparition events, and eventually, over the next couple of decades, they built what you see here. The basilica was begun in 28, consecrated in 53. That tower is 213 feet tall. There are hospitals on either sides, retreat houses, and places for the faithful to come. And every year, in the 13th of May and 13th of October, is when most of the people making pilgrimages will arrive in Fatima. So that is the Lady of Fatima and the visitations. A little bit about King George. So as we all know, King George, essentially George V, is grandson of Queen Victoria, and obviously they're all come from the German side of the nobility, right? So on 17th July, 1917, King George orders the British royal family to dispense with the use of German titles and surnames. So they changed from the Saxe Coburg Gotha to the present day Windsor family. He was the second son of Prince Edward of Wales and the grandson, as I mentioned, of Queen Victoria. He eventually ascends to the throne in 1892 when his older brother Edward dies of pneumonia. Sorry. At the outbreak of the First World War, there was a lot of, as you might assume, there were a lot of strong anti-German sentiment within Great Britain, and that included, casting aspersions on the royal family and all of the royals. And so it's essentially, that's one of the reasons why in July of 17, essentially, he renounces his German heritage, changes his name to Windsor. An interesting thing I found in researching this too is that, knowing that he was kind of looked down upon or looked askance at, he made many trips to the Western Front. And in July, and in 1915, he actually falls off of his horse while visiting one of his units, and he breaks his pelvis, which eventually becomes a problem that will follow him the rest of his life. Another interesting thing, again, I have read a little bit, but I haven't read a lot about it, is he came under a lot of criticism in the fall of 1917 when he refused to allow his cousin, the Tsar, and his family asylum. He was given the opportunity. I'm not sure whether the Soviets would have actually released the Tsar and the family, but there was an effort to try to get George V to go ahead and accept them into the country, but he refused to, and eventually, as we mentioned earlier, they're all executed. Not only did he go ahead and change his family name to Windsor, but he also kind of made an effort to downsize the use of the term Your Highness or Highness. And so he essentially, restricting the use of the title Prince and Princesses. And it really only was then referred to just to the royal family. So it was the heir of the king, sons and daughters, as well as obviously the future kings as well. And as we all know, that the House of Windsor continues even to today. And so, and again, interesting thing, it's probably a smart move on his part to go ahead and renounce his German heritage in order to keep the British populace supportive of him and the family during the war. Everyone should probably recognize this artist, Francois Auguste René Rodin. Essentially, he dies in Paris in November of 1917. You may recognize him for some of his work, such as The Burghers of Calais and The Thinker. But essentially, he was a father of modern sculpture. Started out as a traditional sculptor, but really had a way of capturing a great degree of detail in his clay models that he made for his statues or for his works. He was really possessed a unique ability and was highly regarded by the French society, the French government, up until he started getting into creating 4 different sculptures. And so he created a sculpture honoring the painter Claude Lorraine, President Domingo Sarmiento of Argentina, and the writers Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac. Each of these 4 monuments was challenges. In Nancy, France, where the Claude Lorraine statue was, as well as in Buenos Aires, where the President Sarmiento sculpture caused riots. People were threatening to tear him down because they were upset about the content, and as well as the fact that there were conflicts with the people over the statues of Hugo and Balzac, and that actually got him kind of crosswise with not only the people but the government and as well as the art establishments. And so, how is it that this recognized genius, this hero of France, this creator of all of this tremendous art, how does he end up freezing to death in an unheated studio. Well, again, it goes back to what I've already said. I already gave that up by saying that he had got crosswise with the too many people, and so he continually asked for coal. He continually asked for assistance. He asked to be able to move into his studio, which was in a nice heated building along with all of his work. But a petty bureaucrat in the French museum system essentially kept on saying no, 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 no. So again, on the 17th, was it? Sorry. Yep, 17 November of 1917, they find him frozen to death in his little drafty apartment. Then obviously there's this rush to go ahead and to kind of not cover up so much, but is to make amends for what they had done. And so they essentially, in 1919, this building on the left is the Museum Rodin, which is in the Hotel Briand. And it's in central Paris. It was also one of his places he lived at before he got pushed out to a smaller place. Currently holds about 6,000 sculptures, 8,000 drawings, 8,000 old photographs, and 7,000 other objects of art. Generally get about 700,000 people to visit this museum. Eventually, his other studio was also turned into a museum, and essentially that was opened by the government by 1926. And so I guess maybe, as I said, as an apology maybe to allowing him to be frozen to death, they turned his studio and two of his studios into museums. All right, transition. So who's into hockey? Well, in 26 November 1917, the NHL was formed, right? And so it traces its history back to the Canadian National Hockey Association. So at this period of time, essentially there's the NHA. It's essentially controlled by this guy. His name is Eddie Livingston. He was a man of loose morals, I guess. He was known for stealing players from other teams, from causing distractions, causing events, just making it difficult for the other teams to continue to play. And so there were essentially the other team owners were not very happy with him. And so they attempted to go ahead and they eventually deliver what we call the coup d'etat. There were essentially four professional teams in 1917. They were the Montreal Canadiens, Montreal Wanderers, the Ottawa Senators, and the Quebec Bulldogs. And there was even a military team from the 228th Battalion, essentially. And so in February of 17, the other team owners meet with Livingstone and all of them, and they're essentially talking to him about, hey, we need to, you need to lighten up a little bit. You need to stop raiding players from our teams. You need to just go let us play hockey the way we want to play hockey. Unfortunately, the 228th Battalion ends up having to deploy to the war, and so they're out. So they're down to 4 teams. And so essentially, what happens is they wait until Livingstone is not feeling very well. He's unable to attend the meeting. And on 26 November of 1917, the owners from the other 3 teams essentially decide that what they're going to do is create what is going to be called the National Hockey League, the NHL as we kind of know it today. And they essentially just pushed him off to the side, essentially. Now, the NHL is going to start out with 4 teams. They're the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto. There was actually no name for that. They played its first game on the 19th December of 1917. Essentially, that game was played between Montreal and Toronto, and the Wanderers won, which was their only victory because 2 January of 1918, their arena burned to the ground. So they no longer had a location to play. And so they went from 4 teams to 3 teams, essentially. The Bulldogs, and with 2 teams out because they were using the same arena, essentially this fledgling NHL only operates with 3 teams for the remainder of the opening years. Over time, they build to 10 teams during the time frame interwar years through the beginning of the Second World War. Obviously, the Second World War will limit play as a lot of them are drafted to be soldiers, led them down to during World War II. They eventually get knocked down to 6 teams, known as the original 6. And that era ended in 1967 when the NHL doubled its size. Currently, there are 32 teams. I didn't know this. I thought it was interesting. Currently, there are 32 teams in the NHL, 25 in America, and 7 of them in Canada, and all beginning in the fall of 1917. Talk a little bit about the origins of the Spanish flu or influenza, as begins here in Camp Funston. So, as a note here, on 9 March, essentially, or 8 March, Private Albert Gitchell of the U.S. Army reported to the hospital at Camp Funston, Kansas, complaining of cold-like symptoms consisting of sore throat, fever, and headache. Soon after, over 100 of his fellow soldiers reported similar symptoms, marking what is believed to be the first cases in this historic influenza pandemic of 1918, later known, obviously, as we know, as the Spanish flu. Many scientists believe that the flu this variant that occurs in Camp Funston begins in Kansas. Now, when I used to live in Kansas and I was telling the story, I would blame it on Missouri. Now that I live in Missouri, I have to blame it on Kansas. And so I'm going to go with the Kansas line. Feel free to pick a state that you want to blame on. But they actually traced it back to Haskell County, which is southwest of Dodge City, near Oklahoma and the border of Colorado. Haskell County had been a big cattle country, was a large into pigs as well. And that was maybe one of the considerations is the movement of the virus from pigs to humans. Additionally, it sits on a major migratory flyway where there are 17 species of birds that stay in Haskell County, including the sandhill cranes and mallards. And then scientists today kind of believe that maybe it was this combination of bird influenza viruses with swine influenza viruses that then transferred over to humans and then became what was called the influenza. Not exactly sure that's true or not, but that's what a lot of the scientists talk about. Additionally, several of the Haskell men, all of them training at Camp Funston, they also came down with the flu as well. And so the speculation is essentially that because of the living conditions, and this is a photograph of Camp Funston, that it started from Haskell County, made its way to Camp Funston, and then from Camp Funston, it made its way through to the rest of the world. Again, as we know, if having gone through the pandemic of 2020, it's caused by close personal mingling of people, and clearly in the day-to-day activities of eating at the mess hall or physical training, going down to the canteen to write a letter home, or just marching, back and forth. It's an opportunity for the flu to be passed from one soldier to another. There were 4 waves, essentially. Well, I'm sorry, go back. So essentially there were more soldiers died from the flu than were killed in battle. They say 40% of the Navy was hit, and 36% of the Army became ill, essentially as a result of this flu. There were 4 waves of the flu. First wave in the spring of 1918. It's relatively mild, mostly light cold, chills, fevers, fatigue, and the numbers of deaths were relatively low. There was, however, a second highly contagious wave in the fall of 1918. Victims died within hours or days of developing symptoms, their skin turning blue and their lungs filling with fluid that caused them to suffocate in just 1 year, in just 1 year, 1918. The average life expectancy in America plummeted by a dozen years, just as a result of the flu. The third milder wave occurred during the initial months of 1919, while the fourth and final wave spread through the first months of 1920. The majority of those died in the 1920s were young, healthy adults between the ages of 15 and 44. And we all know why it's called the Spanish flu, so I'm not going to belabor that. This is a photograph from our archives, essentially talking one of the hospitals there at Camp Funston. And then, as a reminder, we do have a small placard in the Western Gallery there in the discussion in the area that talks about medical care, that talks about influenza. Overall, eventually, the flu is going to kill about 675,000 Americans. with an estimated 20 to 50 million victims across the world. Far more deadlier force than what occurred in the war itself, essentially. So essentially, we do have a discussion about the influenza epidemic, and clearly our experiences in 2020, well, I think will help us as we go along. Now, here's something I still lose sleep at after all these years, and that is daylight savings time, right? And so on the 31st of March, 1918, essentially the US adopts the daylight savings time. The decision, obviously, the idea about daylight savings time had been around for a very long time. Essentially, Ben Franklin back in 1784 writes a satirical letter to an editor of a newspaper suggesting that if we, to conserve candles, it would be much better if we could change it back 1 hour. Obviously, it doesn't go very far. No one's really interested in changing the time in order to give us an extra hour of daylight during the year. With regards to daylight savings time in World War I, Germany, along with its allies, were really the first people to introduce the daylight savings time, or Sommerzeit, as they called it, on 30 April 1916, essentially designed to alleviate hardships due to wartime coal shortages and air raid blackouts. The political equation changing in other countries. The UK's adopted the daylight savings time in 21 May 16, and US retail and manufacturing interests, led by Pittsburgh industrialist Robert Garland, gentleman here at the Oregon, soon began lobbying for daylight savings time, but the railroads opposed it. So because the railroads opposed it, essentially the idea of adopting daylight savings time really went nowhere. And so it's not until when we declare war in the spring of 17 that the objections to assuming daylight savings time are overcome, and we assume daylight savings times on the 31st of March of 1918. And obviously, it was met with a lot of propaganda, the idea of trying to convince a lot of people that this was a good idea. As one might assume, it probably didn't do as much as, there's no evidence saying that it gained with whatever it said it was doing. It actually upset a lot of people. The first time that we instituted on the 19th of March was, on 19 March, Wilson signs the Calder Act, essentially saying that on March 31st, they'll move the clocks back. Unfortunately, that happened to be Easter Sunday. And so there were a lot of people who missed church that day. There were a lot of other people who were late covers for a lot of other things. And so there was a lot of pushback with regards to daylight savings time. Newspapers wrote out against it. Businesses wrote against it. Farmers didn't particularly like it. They didn't see that they were getting any benefit from it. But eventually, the problem was, since the government passed it, the government went ahead and kept it in. Now, interestingly enough, it was repealed in 1919. But as my note says, like most weeds, it hung around for a long time. And so by 1920, New York and a dozen other cities had adopted their own daylight savings programs. It kind of comes back into vogue or into use during the Second World War. And then by 1965, 18 states began observing daylight savings time for 6 months out of the year. And so Congress decided they should go ahead and make it nationwide. And so in 1966, they passed the Uniform Time Act, which mandated 6 months of standard time and 6 months of daylight savings. So that is how we got stuck with moving our clocks forward and backwards. The last time we spoke, I talked about the first Zeppelin raid of the war, which was May 31st, 1915. And so the last Zeppelin raid is going to occur in the fall of 1918. Essentially, 4 Zeppelins are going to go ahead and lift off from their bases, and they were going to fly to the Midlands, essentially trying to make their way to London to bomb. As the Germans had found out by the summer of 1916, Zeppelins are really not very efficient. They're slow moving. They have difficulty in, traveling from east to west because of the prevailing air currents. And so with this particular raid with these last Zeppelin raid, They're all intercepted, essentially. Two of them are shot down by aircraft, and another one is shot down by anti-aircraft fire. One of the Zeppelins, L-70, was carrying the German commander of all of the airships. His name was Peter Strasser, and his Zeppelin was shot down and crashed. Eventually, the British recovered the remains of the crew, gave them a burial at sea, and the rest of the airship was brought back. And I'm not sure what they did with it, but they ended up taking it back. Again, because of the problem with this gas-filled bag trying to travel east to west, the Germans actually ended up developing aircraft to help deliver their bomb loads. And so the first one will be the Gotha, which is, and if I counted them correctly, there are 27 people standing underneath the wings of that particular aircraft. So that's kind of how big it was. And then they also developed the Giant. And so the actual last battle, the last air raid here on the 17th is conducted by 38 Gothas and 3 Giants. They took off against London. 6 of the Gothas were shot down by night fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and a 7th aircraft was forced to landing after being intercepted by a Bristol fighter. Overall, German airships dropped approximately 5,806 bombs, while German aircraft dropped 2,772 bombs on England during the war. Now, we can talk about whether it was successful or not. Essentially, those are the bombs. Overall, the aerial campaign caused about 4,700 British casualties, about 2,600 of them in the London area. Estimates between $2.9 and $2.9 million damage were done by these bombing raids. While the bombing raids, the Germans kind of thought that the bombing raids would break the morale of the British populace. It actually kind of didn't do that. It kind of used they used the Zeppelin raids and used the bombing raids to raise morale. However, what it did do is that it did keep approximately 16 squadrons of RAF fighters, as well as anti-aircraft gun and gun crews, searchlights, and the warden system. So it tied up a lot of manpower, a lot of resources that otherwise could have been deployed to the Western Front and to be put to use by the Allies there. So it served more of a propaganda improve the propaganda of the British people more so than destroying the morale of the British populace. Next up are the Allies who ended up fighting in Russia, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians are out of the war essentially by February or March of 1917. While they're still on the front, they refused to attack. The Allies had sent a tremendous amount of resources to be used by the Russian forces. They were at several different camps. And so there was a concern about what are we going to do to safeguard those resources, those supplies, and keeping them out of the Soviets or keeping them out of the Reds' hands. And so the decision was made to go ahead and deploy American forces, part of a combined force with the English, the French, even the Japanese on their border with Russia in the east. So essentially, 2 months after the armistice on November of 18, as the bulk of the Americans on the Western Front are thinking about going home, we still had several hundred American forces in Russia, essentially fighting against the Bolsheviks, fighting with the Tsar's forces against the Bolsheviks. As in the case many times in our history, there really wasn't a clear-cut mission statement, essentially. Wilson was able to finally pare it down to maybe 2 things that he thought that they should do, one of which I mentioned was safeguarding the Allied supplies that we had given to the Russians. And the other one was to provide assistance to the Czech Legion, which was a force initially fought with Austria-Hungary, then had gone over to the Russian side. now they were supportive of the Tsarist forces. So they were actually fighting the Bolsheviks as well. And so, as I said, in August of 1918, President Wilson decides it's time to send American forces there. And so he will ask direct General Pershing to develop to create an army unit, select an army unit, create a command, give it the resources that it needs, and go ahead and send that force to fight along under the command of the British, essentially. And so he agrees to send 13,000 troops, essentially, and they begin their way there. So what unit did General Pershing select to be the backbone of the basis for this organization? And that is the 339th Infantry Regiment, which was in the 35th Division, was made up of mostly draftees from Michigan, some from Wisconsin. Eventually, the 339th became known as Detroit's own, since many of the soldiers were from the Detroit area. On July 8th, that's when July of 18 is when Pershing authorized their separation from the 35th. They traveled to Cowshot Camp in Surrey, England, and by August 27th, they were sailing for Russia, arriving in Murmansk on September the 4th. As we know, winter kind of comes early in the edges of the Arctic, and soon the Detroit zone became known as the Polar Bears. Pierced together, placed under overall British command, as I mentioned before, and there was progressive mission creep, as we kind of get used to using the term nowadays. Military force looking for a potential use or a mission for them to do. By May of 1919, U.S. forces had suffered more than 500 casualties in this North Russian campaign. And by the end of that month, essentially, the decision was made to concentrate forces and to bring the soldiers home. And so the last unit was on its way by the end of June of 1919. And as a reminder, we do have a display that talks about the 339th and the Polar Bears right across from the timeline. Kaiser and the Empire and the Emperor abdicate. So in the autumn of 18, essentially the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Central Powers are not doing very well. German civilian leaders are kind of looking towards the war is obviously going to end. It's not going to end very well. The people at home are starving. The Navy is beginning to mutiny. Essentially, as a matter of fact, the admiral in charge of the Navy actually decides that what he wants to do is he wants to sortie the German fleet one last time in a suicide mission to attack the British fleet that are blockading the German ports. German sailors hear of that, and they actually mutiny to begin to riot in the streets. And so by the 3rd of November of 1918, these rioting, mutinous, socialist-led sailors and civilians were threatening the government. The Kaiser really decided he didn't want to give up his position. I mean, why would he, right? And so he didn't want to do it voluntarily, and so he was going to hang on to the last straw. So the German chancellor met with him on the 7th of November. Essentially, he tried to convince the Kaiser that for the good of the country, what he needed to do was to abdicate. The Kaiser refuses and essentially says he has no trust in his military leader. He has no trust in the civilian leadership. Sorry, but he has trust in his military leadership. But on 9 November, the leaders come to him and essentially say they no longer have trust in the Kaiser, and there's only one thing to do. So the Kaiser needs to go ahead and abdicate, which he does. And he essentially flees Germany, and he ends up going to the Netherlands, and he will live there quietly until he passes on 4 June of 1941. The Emperor, sorry, got ahead of myself, a copy of his abdication. At the same time, Emperor Karl of Austria, he's also under a lot of pressure. The many states that make up the Austro-Hungarian Empire are all suing for separation. They all want to be, get out of the empire. They all want to seek their own separate way. And so he's becoming isolated as well. The military is not doing very well. Supplies aren't reaching the soldiers, foodstuffs aren't reaching the populace, and so there's beginning of a populist uprising or stirring among the people about going ahead and dissolving the empire. They signed their armistice with the Allies on 4 November of 1918, and the breaking up of the army, although the military begins shortly afterwards. On 11 November, he essentially signs a declaration at the Schönbrunn Palace in which he renounces any participation in the affairs of government on the Austrian half of the empire. After quitting Vienna, the imperial family initially make their way to the Schloss Eckerstal in Lower Austria before leaving for exile in Switzerland. At the border between Austria and Switzerland, Karl issues the so-called Frederick Manifesto, invoking the documents he had signed to renounce his participation in the affairs of government and revoking the documents he had signed. He essentially wanted to be allowed to go back and take over the head of the government. He made 2 further attempts to go ahead and come back into to take over the empire, and they were both put down. Eventually, the Allies consider him to be too dangerous, and so they banish him to a Portuguese island of Madeira, where he dies at the age of 35 on 1 April 1922 of the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu gets another victim as well. Reaching the end, folks, hang in there. We only got 3 more things to do. So we all know that on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice is signed and the war is over. But is that really true, right? Does the war end all over the world? And obviously it doesn't, we know that. And so in Africa, the war fighting will continue through the 13th of November, and German forces will not surrender until the 25th. And so as a quick review, we know that the gentleman on the right is Lieutenant Colonel Leto von Warbeck. He was a German commander in East Africa. We may remember from previous discussion that there were 4 colonies, German colonies in Africa: Togoland, present-day Southwest Cameroon, and Southwest Africa. All 3 of those colonies fell to Allied forces within the first couple of months of the year. It's only von Leto Warbeck in East Africa that will continue to put up a fight all the way throughout the war. And so by 1917, he's essentially fighting in this area here in East Africa. Allied forces are pouring in from the north, and so in the middle part of 1917, he will move down to Portuguese colony of Mozambique, where he has relative success. In the spring of 18, after the tropical storms have let up, he's ready to go ahead and attack. So he attacks Allied forces in present-day Zimbabwe. He then moves up into present-day Zambia or northern or British Rhodesia. He actually attacks a British town of, excuse me, sorry. He attacks the town of Kasama, which is in present-day Zambia. Fortunately, the Allies had withdrawn, and so there were really no casualties in the particular battle. He was informed by the Allied commander that the war had ended on the 11th, but he refused to believe that. He thought they were just trying to trick him into giving up his command. And so it takes another 3 days. So on the 14th of November, essentially, he finally gets word from a trusted source that the war is over and that he decides he's going to go ahead and surrender his forces. But he doesn't want to surrender his forces there, kind of in the eastern part of Zambia. He wants to get kind of closer back to what was the German colony of German East Africa. So he's going to march his forces, and on the 25th, he reaches Mbala, or Abercorn, then now Mbala, in present-day Zambia. And on the 25th of November of 1918, he surrenders his forces to the British General Edwards. And this monument is the monument that they created to recognize that event. After surrendering surrendering his flags, and he essentially marches his soldiers over to the nearest lake. They throw all of their weapons and ammunition and not food, obviously, but all of their weapons they throw into that lake because they didn't want the Allies to take possession of that. And they marched their way back to the east coast of Africa. He eventually returns to Germany in January of 1919, where he's feted as a war hero because he's the last German commander to surrender his forces. And that essentially ends the war across, I believe, all theaters of the world. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, so what happened to that German fleet that I kind of mentioned, the one that the sailors refused to sail out into glorious battle right before the end of the war. And so I know a lot of us, when we have tours or we talk to people about it, we kind of spend some time with this reading or talking about this verbiage here, kind of talking about the Battle of Jutland, essentially. And I like to make the point that, the German surface fleet sortied one time, engaged the British, technically beat the British, but then they sailed back to the ports and they were never used again. So essentially the Kaiser spent all of that money on a navy he used once, essentially. So what ended up happening to the rest of the fleet? How did it end up being scuttled in 1919? So a little bit about the Navy itself. I mean, the German fleet, the high seas fleet that we know in the beginning of the war, starts as the idea of Admiral Tirpitz, who becomes the Secretary of the Imperial Navy in 1897. In 1898, he essentially sells the idea to the Kaiser that we need modern battleships if we're going to take our place on the world stage. It's a navy that's going to keep us protected, and so the Kaiser signs the first naval law in 1897. And he Tirpitz kind of put it to an idea that it's a question of survival. We can't survive without a navy to protect our sea lines of communication. So in February of 1907, the high seas fleet was created. It was created out of what was initially called the Home Fleet and was under the command of Admiral Tirpitz. Sorry, mispronouncing his name. Again, he championed for the fleet that would be powerful enough to fight or to hold off the Allies, or England, essentially, is what it was. Tirpitz came up with an idea, essentially, of his risk analysis said that with a strong German fleet, the British fleet would have to be used to protect shipping from the colonies back to the homeland, so that the German fleet would not actually be blockaded like they were, but the German fleet would be free to sail the seas and to intercept these discrete British flotillas as they're escorting the merchantmen to and from the homeland. However, as we do know, that was not exactly the case, and the German fleet is kind of bottled up in its ports for the most part. The only really successful ones that we kind of talked about is the use of submarines and the use of surface raiders, essentially. So those would be more effective, or at least see more service in this war than the actual fleet itself. Now, when the armistice was signed on 11 November, the conditions of the agreement demanded that the entire German U-boat fleet would be surrendered and confiscated immediately. However, they really didn't know what they wanted to do with all that, the home fleet or the high seas fleet. And so it was kind of up to the Allies. That's one of the things they talked about during the negotiations at Versailles. So essentially, Admiral Beatty, the hero of Jutland, essentially meets with the German commander on 16 November. And essentially what he says is that he wants the entire 74 vessels of the German fleet to sail back to England. And so that is what essentially the Germans do. Admiral von Hippers, commander of the German fleet, he refused to take part in this, so he turns it over to a rear admiral named von Reuter. And on 19 November, the fleet of German warship, led by his flagship, the Frederick the Gross, left Germany to rendezvous with Beatty's ships in the North Sea. At that rendezvous, the ships formed up as required, and the joint convoy of 191 Allied and 70 German vessels sailed into the Firth of Forth in Scotland on the 21st of November of 1918. This was the largest fleet of warships ever assembled in England at any time. And that is a picture of them. While they were in the Firth, they essentially were demilitarized, for lack of a better word. But essentially what they were doing is that they were ensuring that all of the ships, the ammunition were offloaded, torpedoes were offloaded, that these vessels were no longer a threat to the Allies or to the British. So then if they're in the Forth of Firth, then how did they end up in Scapa Flow, right? And so the decision was made that the Scapa Flow was a traditional naval base for the English, would essentially be a good place for them to go ahead and put it. And so they all sailed off, and eventually they made their way to Scapa Flow, and that's where they were essentially interred. All right, so over time, the sailors on board the German ships were sent home. So all there were skeleton fleet left on each of the ships, just enough to keep the ship from sinking. There was poor food. There was nothing for them to do. Morale was bad. The socialists' leanings, or the members of the socialists, what they were hearing back, it occurred at home. Though that word was getting back to the sailors. It got so bad on the admiral's flagship that he actually asked for permission to move it from his flagship to another ship, because he just couldn't keep the sailors in line, essentially. On the morning of the 21st of June, 1919, the British fleet decides to go out on naval maneuvers. Unbeknownst to the German admiral, that Beatty had orders to seize all of the German ships on the 23rd of June. And so they were going to go out, do this naval exercise, then come back in and seize all of the German vessels. Admiral von Ritter was under the orders never to surrender his ships, and so he decided, with the departure of the British fleet, that what he would do was go ahead and scuttle it. So at 11 o'clock on the morning of Sunday the 21st, his flagship, the Emden, sends a message which said, paragraph 11, confirmed. And it was the code ordering his men to scuttle their own ships. Beneath decks, the German sailors immediately began to open seacocks, valves that allowed seawater into the vessel, smash pipes. They had already loosened the portholes, watertight doors, and condenser covers were all left open. And within some holes had actually been bored through the bulkheads. There was no noticeable effect initially. The first ship, it wasn't until noon that the British noticed that the first German ship was beginning to list. And the last German ship sank at about 1700, by which time 15 capital ships had sunk, 5 light cruisers, and 32 destroyers were all. So overall, 52 of the 74 interred vessels sank. 9 German sailors were shot as they were attempting to flee their vessels, and about 16 were wounded aboard their lifeboats as they made their way towards land and were picked up by British forces, and they were later sent back to Germany. Essentially, that is the end of the German fleet as we know it. Interestingly enough, sorry, that was what I really was going to say, is even today, if you travel to Scapa Flow, you can dive on some of the ships the German ships that are still there. Sorry, suddenly remembered, one of the things I wanted to talk about was that while the negotiations are going on in France about what to do with the Navy, essentially the Allies wanted to divvy up the German fleet so that every one of them would get the X number of battleships, X number of battle cruisers. England did not want their former allies to have control of all of that naval power. And so they were just going to seize all of that and make them part of the British Navy. Fortunately for the Germans, unfortunately for the British, is that they scuttled that fleet there on the 21st of June, 1919. All right, last item. Again, by special request, you know who you are. But there's really only one weapon that caused the German government to protest to America about its use. Essentially, on the 21st of July of 1918, German soldiers captured a U.S. soldier from the 307th Infantry Regiment, part of the 75th Division, and he was armed with this weapon, the Winchester Model 97 pump action. On 15 September, a little over a month later, another American soldier was captured with a shotgun. On the 15th of September, the German government officially protested the use of the shotgun in a note verbal, or a semi-formal document, a diplomatic note, and passed its way through Switzerland and made its way to the United States. And so essentially what they said is that it was inhumane to use a shotgun during the war. That message came to State Department. From State Department, it was sent to the Secretary of War. And from there, it was sent to the judge advocate, who essentially replied by saying that it was not actually a violation of the code, and it was not, everything that the Germans were saying essentially was untrue. This is a cartoon from that particular time. I thought quite interesting, obviously. After the fact that the Germans had murder of women and children in Belgium, use of the flamethrower, poison gas, mustard gas, Belgian atrocities. So it was the fact that the Germans were complaining about that. And now the Winchester 97 is a pump action shotgun. Many of you will know it's a robust construction, reliable performance, and essentially loads a variety of different shots. There are two major variants: the one that was used for hunting and the one that was used for the trench gun. This is the picture of the trench gun. And what makes it a trench gun, as most of you will know, is the fact that it has a perforated steel heat shield over the barrel, and it has the ability to mount a bayonet on it. And with that, I will end my presentation. Conclusion, again, hopefully this will regenerate an interest in taking a look at the timeline, doing a little bit more research into things that you find interesting. And again, looking for the connections between what you see on the timeline to the exhibits that are artifacts that we have within the museum. These are my references. And with that, I will pause and take any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Mike. I am assured on reasonably good authority that the timeline will continue even after all of the other changes in the museum, although I think they're going to either reprint it and maybe modify parts of it. It will endure. So this was a really interesting lecture and a really good one. There's so many stories in there that it's just, I'm impressed that you were able to dissect out a certain number of them and present them to us in a reasonable time. Well done.